Good morning, everyone. My name is Kelly Phillips Erb, and I am a senior writer for Forbes and also tax counsel for White and Williams. I am thrilled to be here today to introduce to you Grace Perez-Navarro, a global public policy leader with more than 35 years of experience in tax law, international relations, government and executive leadership. She's an American lawyer with a long and distinguished career in public service in the US and abroad. Grace, we're so thrilled to have you today.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. You can't hear me?
Okay.
Uh-oh.
I can hear you now, I think.
Oh, you can?
Yes,
can?
perfect. Okay, thank you. So this is the challenge, of course, with having people in two different places in the world. Are you in Paris this morning?
Yes, I am. I am.
Okay, awesome. And I'm outside of Philadelphia, so we have two continents happening. It's so lovely to meet you. Right off the bat, you and I have something in common, which is that you also got your law degree at Temple University, which is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So tell me a little bit about your path to law school.
Well, I went to Cornell and I actually created my own major there. I wasn't willing to be confined to one that already existed. So I created basically an international studies major, which didn't exist at the time. And I was always interested in international government, history. And so anyway, by the time I got to my junior year, I was trying to decide what to do. And I had decided to apply to both law school and business school. And so I applied to both. I got into both, but I didn't know I got into business school because my father, who was Argentinian, my family is from Argentina, didn't know what an MBA was. He thought business school was like bookkeeping. And so he hid the acceptance letters from me. So that is how I ended up in law school, but it all worked out.
That is a fantastic story. I love that. So how did you choose tax after graduation, and did you take courses at law school that kind of influenced your path forward?
Yes, well, I took tax courses at Temple. I also did the Temple Summer Abroad program, where I took some business tax courses. And so I
In Rome? Oh, sorry, just to interrupt. Was that in Rome?
yes,
Yes, I did that as well. It's fantastic.
we have so much in common. So yeah, so I did that, and I was really interested, or became interested in tax. And I don't know whether when you were there, Jan Ting was still there teaching tax, but for me, he was the inspiration and what led me to pursue a career in tax.
That's awesome. Did you do any work while you were at Temple, like in terms of internships or summers where you worked in tax, or did you just jump straight in after graduation?
I jumped in after law school. I forget where this actually happened, but the IRS came and interviewed people. And so I applied and I started my career at the district council office in Houston.
And can you explain a little bit of what that entails? Because I think it's, when you talk to people about working at IRS, because I interned at IRS in their estates tax division. And it was very interesting to me because I think people think that IRS is just sitting down and like looking at tax returns all day. And that is not at all what you do. And I'm assuming in the chief counsel's office, it's also very different. Can you explain a little bit about what it was that you did while you were at IRS?
Yes. Well, when I started, I was in what is known as a field office, the district council office in Houston. And we would work on cases when you're a new attorney, you work on what are called S cases, small cases. And so we did litigation. We also worked with the appellate team of the IRS and helped them with settlements of cases. We worked with the criminal investigation people. I was lucky in that I also had a special role. I was designated as a special assistant U.S. attorney, working on tax cases well, I should say non-tax cases that involve tax. So like bankruptcy cases, other types of um, federal cases. So that was very exciting. Um, we we did also a lot of planning around types of cases. Like at that point in time, tax shelters were a big thing. So we had special tax shelter groups, and I had actually become part of that just before I moved to Washington to work on international tax. So it was a wonderful experience doing the litigation, working with the field agents and the appellate team.
I was going to ask you about your transition to international because, first of all, I don't think that that's something that a lot of people think about right out of law school. And obviously, you had a transition. But what, I guess now we know your parents being Argentinian, but what was sort of your inspiration for moving to international tax? And how did you find the transition from Texas back to the East Coast? Because I know we have some international folks watching us now, in the US a lot of international law happens sort of Philly, New York, DC on the East Coast. We don't always hear about it a lot in Texas. So, how did that move happen and how did the transition in your career happen?
Well, I had gone to a training session while I was in Houston, and I met Mike Patton, who he was working in the national office in Washington on what we call GL, general litigation type cases. So that would include summons enforcement cases, collection assistance, and other types of non sort of tax court cases. And so I met him at this training session, and I asked him a question he didn't know. So he thought I was smart, but really it was just one of my cases I didn't know and I needed help. And so then he went back to Washington, and this was at the time when they were creating the Associate Chief Counsel International Office. So a few months later, he asked me to join that team because within the Associate Chief Counsel International, which no longer exists, they had a reorganization. But when they first created it with Kevin Dolan as the head, there was a sort of general litigation type function. That's why they chose Mike to head it, but it was for international cases. So this then involved requests for information under tax treaties and other tax treaty related issues. We had the transfer pricing work in there and a range of other types of issues, as well as supporting the international function of the IRS, so the agents and auditors, et cetera.
And I'm going to jump back to transfer pricing in a little bit, but before we get there, I think there's a lot of folks, especially U.S. tax attorneys, that would find IRS fascinating enough to stay in right for life, but you did not. You transferred to OECD, which has been in the news quite a bit lately. But I think a lot of people weren't even aware that it existed when you made the move, right? It wasn't the kind of thing we saw like in the New York Times all of the time. So how did that transition happen?
Well, I was working at the chief counsel's office in Washington, and one day I was asked if I would be willing to go to the OECD for 1 year to help them revise their transfer pricing guidelines, which dated back to 1979. Now, this was at a point in time when the US was revising its transfer pricing rules. This was in the early 1990s. And there had been a white paper put out on transfer pricing and looking at the different methods to be applied. And so the US was actively working on this. So the OECD asked the US if the US would send someone over to help them with this revision. And so, I was asked, this was somebody you probably don't know, John Lyons, and I said, well, how much time do I have to think about it? And he said, 15 minutes. And I said, okay, I'll do it. 1 year in Paris, working on transfer pricing. I thought, well, how bad can that be?
Sure.
so, so that was my first move. I went for the year and then I returned to Washington to the Associate Chief Counsel's office. But then about 3 years later, Jeffrey Owens, who was the head of tax at the OECD at the time, called me and said, I have the perfect job for you. And so I went.
That's awesome. And for our folks who aren't really aware of what transfer pricing is, can you give us kind of the Reader's Digest version of what transfer pricing is and why it's important in the international context?
Sure. Transfer pricing is the method we use to try to allocate income between related parties of an enterprise. So if you think of a big multinational, it will have subsidiaries or branches all over the world, and they are buying and selling things between each other. But of course, there's a risk there that what will happen is that all of the income will be put in low tax jurisdictions and all of the deductions will be put in high tax jurisdictions. And so the transfer pricing rules were created to try to ensure that that kind of manipulation wouldn't happen. And so, how would you set a price for that? And the globally accepted principle is what is known as the arm's length principle. In other words, what would unrelated companies do between each other? What would the normal market forces do to establish the price? And so that is basically what transfer pricing is. Now, as everything has become more global, as the number of multinational companies has grown exponentially, this issue has become more important. Also, more important because now value is generated by multinational companies much more through intangibles like brands and patents, things like that, than just selling a physical good to another company or to a person. And so that's where transfer pricing became trickier and potentially more susceptible to abuse. So that is why it's a much more important issue now.
Right, and we're seeing a lot of conversations around this. Sort of, can you tell us about your role in developing the guidelines and what your work involved with transfer pricing? Because again, it's something that even what. So when I was coming out of law school, we didn't hear about it very often, and then all of a sudden, you start seeing some of the high profile cases, and people are becoming more aggressive about trying to enforce those transfer pricing guidelines, and now we hear about it pretty regularly, right, in the tax world, but it wasn't the case a while back. So, how did you find the work? Was it at the time, was it challenging to get companies to understand what it was that you were hoping to accomplish, or how did you find your role?
Well, initially, my role at the OECD was to take these 1979 guidelines and update them to the current practices or standards. Now, those guidelines, which were very old, were also developed, through the OECD members in a consensus uh, type of environment. And so those guidelines were very, I would say, very high level and general, and had a lot of, I wouldn't say inconsistencies in them, but they would say, on the one hand, the arm's length principle will do this, that, and the other. On the other hand, a formulaic approach might be better, but will be difficult to do among, a whole range of countries. And so there was a lot of, I think, wishy washiness in there. and they were written in 79 when this was all very, very new. If you're saying it was new when you were in law school, back then it was really new. And so when the US started revising its transfer pricing rules, the 482 regulations, one of the things they were looking at was, do we need additional methods for determining an arm's length price? And there were some, I don't want to go too much into the detail, but there were these, standard forms. And what the US did was say, well, maybe we need to look at not just comparable uncontrolled prices, but also look at profit-based methods to determine the right transfer price, or ultimately what was agreed was, there could be a range, that this is a bit of an inexact science. And we know that. You go shopping and you'll find the same item at different prices at different stores. So we then moved to a range. So at the OECD, my role, along with others in the OECD Secretariat, was to foster a discussion about, what are first you start with, what are the current challenges? What is not being adequately addressed with the existing guidelines, and then move from there. And at the time, I can tell you, introducing profit-based methods, which is what we did and what came out in 1995 and still exists today, was very, very controversial at the time. Governments are very cautious and conservative. And so change, especially at the working level where we work. And just to maybe explain a little bit about how we work at the OECD, it's not me writing the rules. We have working groups of technical experts from all of the countries coming together to discuss the issues and revise the guidelines. So that is what we were doing. I mean, at one point, we would have actual text on a screen and edit it, collectively, to try to reach agreement. So that is what we did. And of course, those guidelines continue to be updated as either new issues emerge or further clarification is needed in a particular sector, for example, financial transactions, in intellectual property, all kinds of intangibles, those kinds of things.
And did you find that there was a lot of politicking between the countries? Because I know that's something we were seeing, right, with Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, and with OECD, that this idea that countries maybe feel like they're being discriminated against or unfairly targeted for, it's kind of the same discussions we're having now. Was that still happening back in the 90s?
Well, I don't think at that time countries were necessarily feeling targeted. Probably companies were feeling a little more pressure at the time. I think the challenge was, moving to profit-based methods. The issue was really that the arm's length principle was this notion of, buyer, seller, that kind of basic transaction. And when you go to the profits, it's kind of taking a little bit of a look back and seeing what's fair. So, so that was the challenge. I think the area where we had countries actually feeling quite challenged was when we started the Harmful Tax Practices Project, where we were trying to deal with harmful preferential tax regimes, also in the whole bank secrecy areas. Longstanding members of the OECD, like Switzerland, Luxembourg, Austria, Belgium, all had longstanding, very strict bank secrecy. And so that's where, I think politics came in and countries feeling pressure came in.
Well, that's actually a great transition. Let's talk a little bit about banking secrecy, because, it's something that I've written about this recently, in that I think, especially in the US, we tend to believe that we're very transparent, and the other countries do not necessarily agree. And therefore, we just, we recently have the Corporate Transparency Act that's taking effect next year in the US, where companies are going to have to disclose who owns the companies, right? And this is a huge shift in the US. So this issue has been all over the press here. about, whether or not this is fair and why we have to do it. And it's very interesting to me because I've been focused on this area for a bit now, especially like IRS, CI, criminal investigations, that sort of thing. So it's really interesting to me because I know that other countries sometimes regard us as a bit of a tax. I'm going to say haven in quotes, but we've been very vocal about saying that other countries have been, right, and some of the ones that you just named. So can you maybe talk about the Banking Secrecy Act? Well, not so much the act in the U.S., but the issue with banking secrecy and why it matters, first of all, because I think that's an important kind of place to start. Why does it matter, and what was your work in that area focused on?
Well, this is what actually brought me back to the OECD, because during my exit interview after my 1 year working on transfer pricing, Jeffrey Owens asked me, what should we be working on that we're not working on now? And I said, getting rid of bank secrecy. Why did I say that? Because one of my roles in the national office at the IRS was advising field examiners on international issues. And one of the things they would always say is the financial trail leads me to X country, and I can't get the documents from there because either we don't have a treaty or because the country has bank secrecy and the treaty doesn't override the bank secrecy. And so I had heard this so many times, and I said it was something the US could not overcome alone in its bilateral treaty negotiations. And so this really was something that required a bigger effort. And so 3 years later, when Jeffrey Owens said he had the perfect job for me, this was the perfect job to start working on this. And so, what? Why is it important? It's important because it's very easy for wealthy individuals and companies that want to cheat on their taxes, evade taxes, to simply cross the border. And unless there is access to that financial information in that other country through a tax treaty, or an exchange of information agreement or something, the IRS is stuck. And so it's essential to be able to have that international cooperation, in order to be able to enforce domestic laws. And so, countries say, yes, we're sovereign in our tax policies, but the thing is, taxes and your tax sovereignty stops at your border. And if you don't have a way to overcome that, then you're stuck. And so that was why it was so important to tackle this issue, which I think we have done pretty successfully.
It's really interesting because I would assume that you would, in this case, actually have pushback because we've seen it in the US from various states because their economies are built on this, right? And the same is true for many countries. So, how do you overcome I know you mentioned something earlier about that was fair. I think you used the word fair at one point. I think we were talking about transfer pricing at that point, but it's a similar issue, right? Like this is supposed to be about fairness between countries. How do you convince countries that this is fair when it doesn't feel fair to them, especially if it's where their economy kind of starts?
Well, I think, yes, there were a number of countries and jurisdictions where their economies did depend on secrecy, light regulation, being very friendly to foreign tax payers or evaders. And it was very hard to persuade them. And some initially said it really wasn't that big a problem. And really, we were greatly helped by a number of things. First, the start of the leaks. The Liechtenstein scandal in February of 2008. There were massive leaks of information demonstrating that taxpayers of other countries were hiding their assets, their funds offshore in Liechtenstein. And then there were a series of other leaks. And so with these leaks, it was a bit easier to persuade countries to move ahead. The other thing that happened was, of course, the financial crisis, which brought great political attention at the highest levels. This was the financial crisis is what created basically the G20 at the leaders level, the G20 being the group of 20 countries that includes the largest economies in the world. They then started focusing on this. And that is what led in 2009 to the G20 saying the era of bank secrecy is over. And that was really significant. So the good thing was we had been working on this for some time, and we had been trying to move ahead and had made some incremental progress. But really, it was the financial crisis and the leaks that really made it very difficult for those jurisdictions to deny the fact that there was a problem.
And would you say that your work in this area is what you're most proud of at OECD, or do you have another project that you would say you're most proud of?
Well, I spent 26 years at the OECD. And so definitely the bank secrecy to me, I think was a great, great achievement. That was really important. But I think there are other things that we achieved that were also very important that maybe are not at the same level, but I think important to tax administrations and the functioning of tax systems as a whole. So, for example, the establishment of our work on tax and crime and the tax academies that we now have all over the world, this was important. And the academies was really something that I pushed for because I would run into tax specialists in developing countries saying, where can we get training on how to pursue criminal tax cases? And the thing is, in developing countries, unlike the IRS, the criminal investigation part is very small. They don't have necessarily the resources or the expertise to really devote to the kind of training that is available in the IRS and other more developed countries. And so when I realized that there was no training available anywhere else on this, we decided to set up the academies, and there are now several all over the world, the latest one being established in India. So that to me was very important. It was interesting because I was watching a webinar recently, and one of the participants in the webinar said, oh, and I went to the OECD Tax Academy and it was so great. So that really made me feel good. So that I think was important. I think the BEPS project was very important too, because that really, the bank secrecy work really helped us focus and get at the high wealth individuals who are hiding money offshore. The BEPS project was really focused on tax avoidance. So tax planning that is legal, but is not really what was intended by the law or the tax administrations, things that just go too far. And so the BEPS project, I think, was really important. And then also, I have to mention the work on tax and gender, which I helped spearhead because that was an issue that was not really being addressed anywhere. The World Bank had done some work on it, but it was kind of like a one-off thing. And so that I think was important to launch.
And that's actually a great segue. I was going to ask you, I know that you established the OECD Women's Network, and women in tax, still not very common, a lot more common than it used to be. I used to be the only woman in the room sometimes. Now there are two or three of us sometimes. But also it's not very common in international tax, I've found. So can you explain why you started the network and sort of what it is?
Well, the OECD Tax Network, I didn't start myself. It was a group of women who started it. And then more recently, we revamped it to make it more accessible to everyone in the OECD. And it was precisely the issue of, there weren't many women at the OECD at all. And so it was a way to help women within the organization network and get support from each other, which I think is so, so helpful. And so there were a number of things that we did through the Women's Network. like establish just basic networking. We established a mentoring program that was very successful. And we also use the network to raise awareness of women's issues and to push the gender agenda more generally. Like I remember in the early days, you know, it would be like November, and I would say, okay, before we know it, it's going to be International Women's Day. What is this organization going to do? And now we have a march on gender. Every March, there's like a whole series of events devoted to gender issues in different policy areas: tax, health, climate change, you know, you name it. There's work underway on gender issues.
And for folks who are kind of scratching their head thinking what could possibly be a gender issue in tax, can you explain some of those concepts that are important?
Yes, well, if you think about it in the tax area, you would probably say to yourself, well, I mean, are there really any explicit biases in tax today? You know, we're in 2023, almost 2024. And the vast majority of explicit biases in tax laws have disappeared, but some not that long ago. There are still probably a few around the world, but things like um, not being able to go to the tax authority as a woman without your spouse, your male spouse. That was something that existed, I think, in Jersey until 2020 or something. Yes, so very recent. There are other examples around the world of that negative type of bias. There were also positive biases. In India, I believe, in one of the states, they had preferential tax treatment, a property tax treatment for property in the name of the woman. The idea was to incentivize people to put property in the name of women because obviously that's an important source of wealth. So that's one issue, is the explicit bias, positive or negative, and then you have implicit bias in the tax system, and this is where it's not so much the tax rule itself. The tax rule can be gender neutral, but because of the socioeconomic differences between men and women, the rule can have a different impact on gender. One of the most common uh, issues is the second earner provisions in tax laws, where when you have married couples filing together jointly, the second earner is basically disincentivized from working because if it's a progressive tax system, the second earnings will be taxed at a higher rate. And so those are the kinds of things that need to be looked at. Also, in consumption taxes, looking at differences in how men and women spend. So there are a lot of issues. It was interesting when we first started exploring this. I remember one of our female economists was like, I'm not sure there's any there. And lo and behold, there's a whole lot there. The question then is, how do you address these issues? Because if you do try to adapt the tax system, then you are also introducing greater complexity. So there's a lot of different things that you have to take into account, but we wanted to at least highlight for tax policymakers how the tax system can affect gender equality.
And since you mentioned Ting earlier, I will mention that the first time I ever heard about gender inequality in the tax world was Professor Abreu talking to us about the very issue that you just mentioned with second wage earners. I just never thought about it in that way because I'm from an area in the U.S. where not a lot of women worked. So I grew up in the rural South. And so it was very interesting to me to hear her say that and now to hear you say it as well. So speaking of women in tax, like what advice can you give to women in the profession? Because the things that you've talked about today and the positions that you've been in are not something that I think a lot of young women in the profession think that they can achieve, right? Like it seems OECD, to be in Paris working for the OECD is, I think a lot of young tax professionals' dreams. How do you get there, and what kind of advice would you give, especially younger folks in the profession who maybe don't know how to find a mentor or what to look for, or they don't know the person they're gonna run into in the hallway who's gonna say, "Hey, do you want to move to Paris? You have 15 minutes." So, what kind of advice would you give to them?
Well, I would say first, there is no substitute for working really hard. But working really hard is not the only thing that will help you move up and expand your professional opportunities. I do think networking, both men and women, it's important. It's really important. Why? Because a casual, contact with somebody might later lead to a job. I'll give you one great example. I was at the Korean ambassador's residence for, it was a Korean national holiday. I didn't know many people there, but I went and I met this young woman by the beautiful buffet table. And so I asked her what she was doing. She said she was a student studying human resources and she really wanted to work in an international organization. So I said, well, I'm working at the OECD. I know the head of human resources. Maybe you can get an internship. Send me your resume. So she did. I contacted HR. I said, I bet you get a lot of intern applications, blah, blah, blah. And she said, actually, no, we don't get many. We'd love to have her. This woman went on to be an intern, to work at the OECD, and now she's working in HR at a private equity fund in Switzerland. So, you just never know that a casual contact can make such a difference. So you don't have to be too strict and focused about your networking, but get out there, whether it's doing sports, a book club, going to events at whatever organization you're working in, at your alma mater. Meet people, because that is a way to find new contacts.
Absolutely. And I actually find it really fascinating that you had that conversation, because I do think that one of the things I hear a lot are that younger professionals, especially women, feel intimidated coming up to people at uh, at events, right? Because they feel like maybe, or I think especially culturally, some parts of the world, including where I grew up, you feel like you're intruding, right? Or that maybe it's an imposition. So I love that you were by the buffet table chatting, because I do think that, finding opportunities everywhere is super important. So that was terrific advice about, just kind of putting yourself out there. So thank you for that. What would you say would be the most rewarding part of your career? I know we talked about things that you're proud of, but just overall.
Well, I think the most rewarding has been to see tangible results in the countries that we're trying to help. And so, going back to the exchange of information and bank secrecy, I mean, we have seen country after country, reap the rewards of that. I think it's now, I'm just looking, 126 billion euros of additional revenue have been identified by countries around the world, including developing countries, as a result of bank secrecy being eliminated, a greater network of exchange of information. We had a multilateral convention within the OECD. We then opened it up in 2010 to countries around the world. There are, I think, over 145 countries that now can access information, not just banking information, but other types of information from other countries, because of the broad network this convention provides. So to me, the most rewarding thing has really been seeing that our work, we're not just writing reports and models and guidelines, but seeing tangible improvements on the ground. Like one of the things I worked on, getting back to transfer pricing, was helping Brazil change its transfer pricing system, which was based not on the arm's length principle, which is what most of the world uses. they were using basically this fixed margin method. And working with them over a period of 5 years, we were able to show them how they were losing money by not using the arm's length principle. And so it was very rewarding to see that legislation get passed and see the auditors now working to implement the arm's length principle.
What would you consider the most challenging part of your career?
Well, I think the most challenging part has been managing work-life balance. This is something we all struggle with. I think when you're working in a place like the OECD, public service, where you're trying to help countries around the world, it's not just a job that you just turn off your mind at the weekend. It was really all consuming. But as I said, incredibly rewarding. I think the other thing was the frustration that, again, in public service, I think everyone has, is that there are never enough resources to do what you need to do. So you're always kind of behind.
I can imagine. So I know that you were named Tax Notes International Person of the Year. And it's always nice to be recognized, but I think, that's a pretty big one, especially in the context of international and being a woman. Can you tell us what that meant to you?
Oh, it was very exciting for me. I was very appreciative of it because I spent most of my career at the OECD as the deputy director of the Center for Tax Policy. And, being a deputy, it's a very important role and I enjoyed it. Don't get me wrong, but you are you're not always sure people recognize your contribution because it's usually the director that's in the limelight. And so to me, I really appreciated being acknowledged in that way because it did show that people did actually recognize my contribution.
And I don't know if you are able to tell us or not, but you recently made another career change. Can you tell us what's coming next, or is that still under wraps?
Oh, well, well, for the moment, I'll tell you, I feel like I'm kind of in that gap year that Europeans all often take between high school and college. I never had that. And so I have been, since I left the OECD, doing sort of one-off things that are either fun or intellectually interesting. So I've been speaking at different conferences and I've continued my mentoring. So now I am part of the Cornell President's Council of Women, and they have a mentoring committee. So I'm now mentoring students at Cornell. I'm still mentoring women at the OECD, and that's been very rewarding. I was helping this group of Israeli tax lawyers establish their own women's network because they didn't have one. So that was also very interesting, and so that's what I've been doing, and I hope by the end of my gap year I will have decided what, if anything, I will do next. But it's been great. I've had, as you can imagine, a lot of different job offers, but for the moment, I'm basically having fun and engaging in, select projects.
I was going to say, I think most people for their gap year just lounge around, but it sounds like you're doing a lot. So I have just a couple of like last minute fun questions, and then I know that our conference leaders have a word or two they'd like to say. So I have just a couple of fun questions if you have another minute. So my first is, what would you consider your superpower to be? Like if you had a superpower.
Okay, well, my friends would say my superpower is I order well in restaurants. Everyone always wants what I have ordered.
Nice.
But
Excellent.
I would say my real superpower is remaining calm and appearing to be calm even when I'm not calm, which is important in this kind of work.
It's also important in law. It's something I have not managed after all these years to do. I remember sitting in chambers one time when a opposing counsel was saying something untrue, and I was sort of bouncing on my hands because I was so annoyed that it was happening, and the judge said, "Miss Erb, you can't even sit still." And I was like, "No, I cannot." So I wish I had that superpower. I cannot remain calm. What's one surprising thing about you that people don't know?
I've wrestled an alligator.
Really? Where?
Well, I was at the meeting of the Financial Action Task Force in Orlando. So these are all the money laundering experts of the world who come together. And this one year recently, they came together in Orlando, and we were taken to this alligator exotic animal farm and offered the opportunity. So since it was, as you can imagine, mostly men at this event, I thought a woman needs to show she can wrestle an alligator
That's
too.
fantastic. Was it scary?
A little bit. The key
Oh,
is to hold the head up so the jaws don't open.
yeah, no. That's one thing I won't be doing. What is your favorite thing about Paris?
I think my favorite thing is that it has all of the things you want from a big city, cultural things, great restaurants, theater, but it doesn't feel like a big city. And so I like the fact that it offers you everything that a big city has, but it still feels kind of neighborhoody.
Got it. And my last fun question is, when you moved abroad, what did you miss most about the US?
24 everything.
Mm,
Here, now things have changed in France, but it used to be everything was closed on Sundays, everything was closed on holidays, stores shut at 7. And I remember when I went back after my first year in Paris, and because of jet lag, I woke up at like 5 or 6 in the morning. I was wide awake. What do I do? What do I do? Oh, I can get car insurance now. And I called Geico, and within minutes, I had car insurance at 6:05. It was wonderful. You could not do that in France. I'm not sure you could do it today, even. But so, yeah, that kind of availability of everything at all times.
my husband feels both ways about that because he used to live in Munich, and that's what he said as well. Like he hated that the stores were closed on Sundays, but now that we're here and things are open all the time, he's like, "Gosh, I wish we didn't have anything to do on Sunday." But now he's just like, "He would have to go to the store, right?" So well, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. I love, hearing about how you have, used your interest in tax in many different areas, and for making a change not only internationally but also for women in the profession. So thank you so much for your time today. And I do know that our conference leaders would like to say a few words before we go. So thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Kelly. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you so much. And then thank you so much, Grace, for honoring our invitation to interview and then share your life experience. And I must really say that you have lived a life full of impact. And I was really, really excited reading about you. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is actually a whole lot. And thank you so much for making time to speak to us and then share your experience with us. I just want you to say some few words to young professionals across the globe. What do you want to say to inspire us, to inspire the young professionals across the globe who are interested in tax, do something related to tax? Just share some few words and parting words. Thank you.
Okay, well, I would say to all those young professionals interested in tax, international tax is really, really fascinating. It's hard work because you're not limited to one tax system, but to many. But that's the beauty of it, seeing the interactions and seeing how those can be used or abused. Hopefully, you'll just be using them. But it's an exciting, exciting field, and there are great opportunities in this area. So I would encourage all young professionals to persevere and pursue work in this area.
Does it get any easier? I know it's hard work.
No, well, I guess in some ways it gets easier as you gain experience, like with anything. But the thing about international tax is that it's constantly changing, because even, in a domestic context, you could say, okay, tax reforms happen a lot, but it's every few years that you get a really big reform. But when you're dealing with international, things are changing everywhere all the time. So it's a challenge to keep up, but I think it's really worth it. I've had just a wonderful career and wouldn't change a thing about it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you, thank you, thank you, Kelly, so much. Thank you, thank you. And on behalf of the committee, I'm also saying a big thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And I wish you a very successful conference.
Thank you.